Retiring undefeated at 46 wins and 0 losses, becoming a multiple weight world champion, and having the distinction of being the longest reigning super middleweight world champion in boxing history, Joe Calzaghe left a legacy in boxing most could only dream of. However, I often feel he's overlooked in the discussion of all-time greats of the sport. So how good was Joe Calzaghe actually? After winning 110 out of 120 amateur bouts, winning multiple ABA titles, each at different weight classes, which made Joe the only British amateur boxer to ever do so, and only the second boxer in history to accomplish such a feat, Joe was an outstanding amateur to say the least. But despite all that amateur success, he actually never went to the Olympics, with his father Enzo Calzaghe claiming it was due to the politics in Welsh boxing at the time, saying the issue was that the Welsh ABA Council took issue with the fact that Joe was unable to fight in an international event, even though he was out with a hand injury, and they said that Joe had become arrogant. Now, if anyone knows more about that situation from another perspective, please let me know, but it sounds like Joe was out of favour with those at the top of Welsh amateur boxing, and as a result, he and Team GB would miss out on a chance to get a medal at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics. With the Olympics not on the cards, Joe would turn to the professional ranks in 1993, with his father and amateur coach Enzo Calzaghe training and managing him. On the undercard of Lennox Lewis vs Frank Bruno in Cardiff, the 21-year-old Calzaghe would take on British fighter Paul Hanlon, who he dispatched in a round, and he would go on to breeze through his next 12 fights, winning all of them, with only one of them not ending in a knockout. After comfortably amassing a record of 13 wins and 0 losses, Joe would get his first major fight of his career when he fought for the vacant super middleweight British title against Scottish fighter Stephen Wilson. Wilson would show a solid account for himself, giving Joe plenty to think about as he took the fight all the way to round 8. It wasn't the most technically pleasing performances from Calzaghe, who was still very raw, swinging wildly at times. In round 8, Calzaghe would step on the gas and look for the finish. He swarmed all over Wilson, landing some power shots, but I didn't get the impression that Wilson was overly hurt. However, the referee saw the fight much differently as he stepped in to stop the fight, which, in my opinion, it was a poor stoppage. I felt that Wilson deserved more time, but despite that, Joe was now the British super middleweight champion. Over the next few years, Calzaghe would make relatively light work of his next 8 fights, ending all of them early, beating gatekeepers and world title challengers, and showcasing solid hand speed and accuracy. Despite the criticism around his opponents, Joe was doing exactly what he was supposed to do, beating every man in front of him and doing it in emphatic fashion. He'd then be signed by Frank Warren in 1996, with Frank aiming to get the Welsh prodigy a fight with then WBO champion Steve Collins. However, the fight didn't happen due to Collins picking up an injury and then retiring from the sport, which made the belt vacant, and instead Joe would take on the legendary British boxer Chris Eubank for the vacant world title. After amassing a record of 22 wins with 22 knockouts, this would easily be Calzaghe's toughest test yet. Eubank was 50 fights deep into his professional career, having 21 world title fights under his belt. And coming into the fight, he got 2 knockout victories following his second loss to Steve Collins. So by no means was Eubank washed, as some make out, but he did have plenty of mileage on the clock and was clearly coming to the end of his career. The fight couldn't have started any better for Calzaghe, as he dropped the durable Eubank in the very first round, putting him down with a big left hand. Despite the dream start, it wouldn't be such an easy fight as it initially looked, as Eubank would make it a very physically draining fight. Eubank said prior to the fight that he would take Joe into the trenches, and he did just that. When asked about this fight, Joe actually said that this was one of his most exhausting fights in his career. He said on the James English podcast that he was exhausted after 4 rounds, after putting too much energy into stopping Eubank following the knockdown, and he drained his gas tank early, which made the fight a very grueling one. Despite his best efforts over the course of the next few rounds, the knockout never came. Both men were visibly shattered in the 7th round, with plenty of clinching going on. In round 10, Calzaghe would get another knockdown. Eubank would rush into range but was caught with a left hand that put him off balance and made him touch the canvas with his glove. Calzaghe showed some solid counter-punching, making Eubank pay each time he would come into range. Eubank would keep in there until the very end, making Calzaghe work into the final bell, and after a grueling 12 rounds, Calzaghe would win by unanimous decision, becoming the WBO world champion at only 25 years old. Joe would successfully defend his belt twice in 1998, before entering what is easily up there as one of his toughest fights of his career when he faced WBC champion Robin Reed, arguably the closest Joe got to losing in his career. Reed clearly adapted much better to Calzaghe's style than most fighters, and was able to get plenty of success landing some solid right hands to head and body of Calzaghe. Round 8 would play a major factor in the overall outcome of the fight, as Reed would have a point taken off which was very much justified, as Reed fought dirty multiple times in this fight. The remaining rounds were fairly competitive. Reed landed the more eye-catching shots, in my opinion, with a notable right hand in round 9 which snapped the head back of Calzaghe. Joe would show off the better variety of punches and was picking off Reed from range. The final round would end in a shootout with both men trading in the pocket to end what was a very competitive fight. But having watched it back, despite Joe taking plenty of shots in there, I felt that his overall output and shot selection won him the fight by a few rounds. Definitely a fight that could have done with a rematch. Joe would continue to successfully defend his belt as we entered into the 2000s, getting a solid 5th round KO against Omar Sheikha, who was coming into that fight in fine form, beating a former world champion in Glenn Johnson on points in his last fight. Then in December of 2000, Joe would take on what was seen as another fight that is definitely up there in the hardest of his career, when he went up against former WBC world champion and well-known boxing pundit Richie Woodhull. Woodhull showed his pedigree in this fight. It's easy just to see him as a pundit these days, but he was a very skilled operator in his day, being a highly accomplished amateur, winning bronze in the Olympics and a gold in the Commonwealth Games. In his last fight of his pro career, Woodhull gave a fantastic account of himself against the young champion. Clearly not on the same technical level as Calzaghe, he still managed to gain plenty of success, showing punch variety as he managed to hit Joe with accurate shots from head to body, which caused Joe some problems. However, I felt the difference maker in the fight was the speed advantage Joe had. He would beat Woodhull to the punch and get the better of the exchanges. He also showed a better gas tank throughout the fight, and I also felt in the latter rounds Woodhull was pretty much spent. Joe wouldn't let Woodhull breathe in the fight and showcased solid ring generalship as he dictated the majority of the fight, something the much bigger and stronger Woodhull was unable to do. In round 9, Joe would get the better of the exchange, overwhelming Woodhull with a combination which ended in an uppercut which put the Birmingham fighter down. Round 10 came and Calzaghe would look to get the finish, swarming all over Woodhull, eventually putting him up to the ropes where he would unload fast combinations, which led to the referee jumping in and stopping the fight. In 2002, Joe would make it 10 successful title defences when he beat Philadelphia fighter Charles Brewer over 12 rounds, which was a fairly tough fight despite Joe winning by unanimous decision. The experienced Brewer offered plenty in there and clearly came to fight. In 2003, he would face former WBA champion Byron Mitchell. The fight looked like it was going to be stopped in the very first round, as Calzaghe would unload fast and accurate combinations, but Mitchell somehow managed to power through them and head into round 2, where he would be handing Calzaghe his first career knockdown. Joe would become too open and was caught with a right hook flush on the chin. But Joe would show everyone how a true champion handles adversity, as he got back onto his feet and would immediately engage in a war. And this time he would get the better of the exchange. Mitchell would miss out on a left hand, only to be countered by a left hook from Calzaghe, which sent the American crashing into the ropes. Mitchell would get back up and make the mistake exchanging in the pocket with Joe, as he would be overwhelmed by the speed and overall output, which forced the referee to step in and stop the fight. Calzaghe showed he had a hell of a lot of heart and will, and would have to showcase that once again when he took on New York-based Egyptian fighter Kabari Salim. Salim was well known for being a dirty fighter and continued that reputation into this fight, cutting Calzaghe due to a head clash as he kept leading with his head, like a certain Leeds warrior, and also hit Calzaghe with a shoulder when in the clinch. Looking to try end Salim early, in round 4, Joe would become overly aggressive and unload a barrage of punches, which opened himself up to be caught with a short right hook, which hit him flush on the chin. However, Joe wasn't massively hurt and managed to regroup and box to a 12-round unanimous decision with a knockdown of his own in round 12. In 2006, Joe would finally have his coming out party. Despite amassing a very impressive record of 17 title defences, many people on the other side of the pond viewed Joe with heavy skepticism, which is kind of common in American boxing culture, as many fans from the States have this mindset that if you haven't fought one of their guys, you're not legit. Now, I'm not saying that's all Americans, by the way. I know a lot of you watch these videos. Anyway, Joe would take on undefeated IBF world champion Jeff Lacey, who at the time was drawing comparisons to Mike Tyson due to his heavy hands. So yeah, he was very hyped up around this time, with many Americans very confident that he would beat Joe. Despite Joe having lots of issues with his hands leading up to the fight, something he would have to deal with throughout his career, he would put on a masterclass of a performance and announced himself to the American public. Arguably the best performance of Calzaghe's career, he would make a mockery out of the betting odds, which deemed him an underdog in this fight. Lacey was outboxed and outfought all night. Calzaghe landed over 1,000 punches in this fight, while Lacey didn't even land half of that. Calzaghe would breeze his way through the fight, winning every round and even putting Lacey on the canvas for the first time in his career to win by unanimous decision. It could be argued that Lacey was never the same fighter after this fight. In 2007, Joe would look to add to his collection of world titles when he took on the undefeated WBA and WBC champion Mikkel Kessler. The fight began very competitively, with both men having their moments in the early rounds. Kessler was very sharp and landed arguably the cleanest shots. In round 4, Kessler landed uppercuts that stunned Joe, and it was at this moment Calzaghe identified Kessler was having a lot of success with that type of shot, and adjusted accordingly. In the mid to late rounds, Calzaghe made the much needed adjustments to score the fight more clearly in his favour when he started to use more of his boxing skills, which offset the Danish fighter. And it was in the second half of the fight where Calzaghe would start to take over. Kessler, despite being a very technically sound fighter, was unable to match the sheer volume and speed at which Calzaghe fought at, losing out in exchanges and was unable to catch Calzaghe with anything substantial. In round 12, Kessler would try his best to try change the tide, seeking big power shots, and he did land some big shots, but it wasn't enough and Calzaghe would win by unanimous decision, and he firmly established himself as the very best that the super middleweight division has to offer. After conquering the super middleweight division, Joe would move up weight to 175 pounds to take on light heavyweight champion Bernard Hopkins. Hopkins, much like Calzaghe, ruled his division for many years, being the middleweight champion for 10 years and setting a division record for 20 title defences. It would be a nightmare start for Joe, as in the opening round, Hopkins landed a fast 1-2 which put Calzaghe down. In the mid to late rounds, Calzaghe would start to take over the fight due to his superior output and ring generalship. Despite Hopkins still landing effective and solid shots, I just felt Calzaghe was just doing enough to win the later rounds. This fight was a very tactical affair, with both fighters' styles not exactly meshing well into a good fight to watch. After a 12-round chess match, Calzaghe would win by split decision.
I would never let a white boy beat me. I would never let a white boy beat me.
Newbridge Wells still undefeated.
Calzaghe would end the year with the last fight of his professional career against another all-time great of the sport and 4-division world champion, Roy Jones Jr. Despite clearly not being the Roy Jones of old, where many thought he was genuinely invincible, he was still a solid fighter and wasn't quite shot to pieces as he later became when he continued fighting for another decade after this fight. You could argue that Joe wasn't in his prime either, due to how depleted his hands were and the fact that he was getting on in age. Something nobody expected was Roy dropping Calzaghe in the very first round, as Jones landed a blistering jab followed by a right hand where Calzaghe was caught by the forearm of Jones. Jones wasn't able to capitalise on that success, however, and the fight would change in Calzaghe's favour. Jones was dominated largely by speed and the work rate from Calzaghe. Calzaghe's engine is one of the best in the sport, and just like his previous fights, he was able to overwhelm Jones with his volume of punches. The various feints and flurries of punches just kept the Welshman in control for the majority of the fight, with Jones having some success, but it was usually met with Calzaghe throwing a multitude of punches to answer back. Jones would also be the first to start to fatigue in the later half of the fight. Calzaghe would deservedly win by unanimous decision, and a familiar stat came up after the fight showing that Calzaghe massively outlanded Jones. Following the win, Joe and his father would come to the decision it was best to hang up the gloves. From hearing from Calzaghe himself in interviews and podcasts, etc., it sounded like his hands were just essentially destroyed at this point. A rare moment where a fighter will retire at the very top of the sport, and even rarer to retire undefeated. So with all that said, how good was the pride of Wales, Joe Calzaghe, actually? Well, he finished his career at a very impressive 46 wins and 0 defeats, along the way picking up belts in 2 weight divisions, and honestly never really looked in trouble in those 46 fights. Yes, he had plenty of competitive fights where he had to face adversity, and it split opinions on whether he won, but he was not once completely outclassed or out of his depth. What I think is most impressive about Calzaghe was his ability to switch up his style. Famously, he had problems with his hands like I've mentioned, becoming gradually worse in the later half of his career, but it was at this point in his career where he actually would do his best work. In the early days of his career, he adopted a more boxer-puncher style. However, due to his hands degrading over time, he was forced to focus purely on his boxing and opted for less power shots. A lot of criticism of Calzaghe is directed towards that new style that I mentioned. He's often accused of slapping his opponents, but that was mainly due, like I said, to his serious hand problems that affected Joe throughout his career, where he's clearly trying to preserve his hands as much as possible. Another criticism I see labelled at Calzaghe is the fact that he mostly fought in his hometown with only a few fights outside of the UK, but I think it's just an example of double standards that some American boxing fans have, and I say some, I'm not overgeneralising. But there didn't seem to be much pushback against, say for example, Floyd Mayweather every time he fought in the US, so I don't see why it should apply for European fighters. What I will concede about Calzaghe is his resume isn't exactly the most stacked. It was mostly in the later half of his career where he started racking up serious wins, so there's 100% an argument to be made for the level of his WBO defences. There's no denying there were some weak contenders on there for sure. There's also the fact that many of the big names Joe fought were past their prime, such as Eubank, Hopkins and Jones, but I don't blame Joe for that. He beat what was in front of him, and there's no doubt all of those guys were still very good fighters. But criticism aside, I have no doubts in saying Joe is easily one of the best super middleweights to ever do it. It goes without saying. 21 successful title defences, beating 8 world champions with his best wins for me being Kessler, Lacey and Hopkins. With longevity alone, I'd say he has to be in the top 3. But his legacy is not just the fact that he was one of the best super middleweights to ever do it, but he's arguably the best British fighter ever. For me personally, I have Lennox Lewis up there, but I wouldn't really put up much resistance if you said Joe was your pick for the best fighter the UK's ever produced. Joe was a great all-round fighter with fantastic foot movement, hand speed, solid power, and an unbelievable gas tank. So let me know what you make of Joe Calzaghe in the comments below. Where do you think he ranks in the all-time great list from the UK and also the super middleweight division? And also, thanks to these guys for suggesting this video.